Number 10. The Iron Hand. How cool would it be to have an iron hand? You could punch through brick, you could crush your enemies, and you could stick your hand directly into a fire. You'd be pretty well invincible. But then again, you wouldn't really play video games or text anyone since you wouldn't have a thumb. But that didn't matter in the 16th century, where our first archaeological discovery took place. One of the first prosthetic limbs in history was used by a fierce German mercenary knight named Gotz, and sometimes referred to as Gotz the Iron Hand. He lived in the early 1500s and was a soldier for hire. He also got hit by a cannonball in 1504 and lost his arm. To keep fighting, the clever mercenary developed the first iron hand ever. It's unclear who built this artifact, but it was definitely used by Gotz. It didn't give much of a range of motion, but he could still hold a sword with it, and he could still punch people with it. But then a few years later, the mercenary upgraded to an even better iron hand. According to the American Journal of Surgery, the second hand was able to be manipulated using his left hand. He could tighten the joints at the knuckles to allow for a tighter grip. This helped for holding a sword, holding the reins of his warhorse, and even using a quill to write with. The mercenary's prosthetic limb is kept today inside a small castle in a German town of about 1,600 people. Gotz the Iron Hand is their historical pride and joy, with the prosthetic limb even being featured on their coat of arms. Number 9. The Brea Woman. The Brea Woman was the name given to the girl whose remains were discovered at the Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. The remains were first discovered in 1914, and they turned out to be the partial skeletal remains of a woman who had died at around 25 years old about 10,022 years ago. To date, she is still the only person who has ever been discovered inside the Brea tar pits. You might be wondering how just one person in all of history could be found at a site like the Brea tar pits. Well, archaeological evaluations of the woman's skeleton showed that her skull had been fractured, probably by a blow to the head, and that was likely the cause of her death. It was probably that her body was dumped into the tar pits like you might dump a corpse into a sinkhole to try and hide your crime. But considering the woman lived in North America 10,000 years ago, nobody really knows what happened that caused her body to be lost in the sticky tar of the pits. Number 8. Mysterious dinosaur bones. A mysterious new archaeological discovery of 2 dinosaur skeletons has revealed a totally new species of Nothosaur, a group of aquatic reptiles that lived in the water during the Triassic period over 200 million years ago. Because of their small heads, wide snouts, and flipper-like limbs, the bones were easily identified by paleontologists as belonging to a Nothosaur. However, the bones were found with much shorter tails than any other specimen of Nothosaur. And while this may sound super boring so far, it's actually quite interesting. According to a doctor from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the new species adapted differently than the other Nothosaurs, which means we're looking at a bridge in evolution. The newer Nothosaur, with their smaller tails, could hang out at the bottom of the sea without exerting much energy, which could have made them more reliable predators. It means that even 200 million years ago, dinosaurs were still evolving. It makes you wonder what would have happened if it hadn't been for that blasted meteorite. What would another 200 million years of evolution have turned these creatures into? Number 7. Edward Scissorhands. Archaeologists have made an extremely bizarre discovery. Not only did they find a makeshift prosthetic device on a warrior buried 1,000 years ago, but the prosthetic device wasn't even what you would expect. Rather than having an iron hand like the German mercenary, this guy replaced his arm with a sword. According to the report from Archaeology magazine, wear found on the skeleton's teeth suggested that he had been adjusting the prosthetic straps using his mouth for quite some time. They also discovered calluses and bone spurs on the stump of his arm that showed exactly where he had replaced his limb with a sword. It had basically become a part of his body. Where was such a brave warrior discovered, you ask? He was found inside of a necropolis in northern Italy, among several other skeletons, a headless horse, and even some dogs. But he wasn't Italian or from the Roman Empire. The man was part of the Lombards, who were a Germanic people that ruled nearly all of the Italian peninsula between 568 and 774 after the fall of the Byzantine Empire. The Lombards were a ruthless warrior people, so it makes sense that when one of them lost a limb, he'd simply screw a sword onto the stump and continue stabbing his enemies. Scientists believe that the warrior died probably around the age of 50, but his arm being amputated likely happened much earlier in his life. Number 6. Viking poop. Get ready to be grossed out. Our next story today is about Viking poop. That's right, archaeologists have discovered perhaps the best preserved piece of poop ever. It was found in New York way back in 1972 under what eventually turned into a bank. This is why the preserved Viking excrement was called the Lloyd's Bank Coprolite, or if you prefer, the Lloyd's Bank Turd. But why is such a discovery important? It seems like something that nobody would really care about, but that's not true at all. Some paleontologists have referred to the fossilized Viking coprolite as being as precious as the crown jewels. This is because the poop dates back to the 9th century when the area of York in England was ruled by ferocious Norse kings. It's a very important time in English history. Even more interesting is what scientists were able to determine simply by doing DNA testing on the poop. They were able to extract tons of information from the fossil, including that the human who had deposited it had a diet of meat and bread, but they also had intestinal issues. The Lloyd's Bank coprolite was apparently filled with whipworm and mawworm eggs. This probably meant that the Viking warrior had stomach aches and other nasty gastrointestinal problems. If you're feeling particularly curious, you can check out the most famous poop in the world at the Jorvik Viking Center, where it sits safely inside of a glass box. Number 5. The Khufu ship. The Khufu ship is one of the most impressive Egyptian vessels ever found. It was originally discovered in 1954 inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. The vessel was also found with the famous Egyptian pharaoh himself, whom the Great Pyramid was built for. The wooden ship was constructed 4,600 years ago, and so well designed that it could actually still set sail if launched back onto the Nile River even today. The exact purpose of the boat is still a bit of a mystery, but one of the prevailing theories is that it was placed inside of Khufu's burial chamber so that he could sail across the heavens after death to be with the sun god Ra. The ship was found under a stone wall on the southern side of the Great Pyramid, and it took over a decade for experts to put together all 1,224 individual pieces of the giant boat. It's now sitting inside a specially designed museum just outside the pyramid. As for Khufu, he was the second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty. He ruled Egypt over 2,500 years before Jesus was born. But other than commissioning the Great Pyramid of Giza to be built, there's little else known about him. Number 4. Prehistoric bongs. This next one is for the stoners out there. Anyone who thinks bongs are a modern device is absolutely wrong. Archaeologists actually discovered bongs crafted of solid gold that were used by the ancient Scythians almost 2,500 years ago for cannabis. The discovery was made by archaeologists in southern Russia, and they found over 7 pounds of gold artifacts from the time of the Scythians, who were a nomadic people that ruled much of Central Asia back in the time that Khufu was ruling Egypt. The gold artifacts included jewelry, cups, and of course, the bongs. But not only were they used for smoking ancient marijuana, they were also used for opium. It turns out that even the most ancient of civilizations had a bit of a problem with drugs. Greek historians claim that the Scythians used the gold vessels to brew an opium concoction, which they may have drank before smoking the cannabis. It's unclear whether these substances were used for ritual purposes or just for recreation. However, scientists are positive that they used both substances at the same time. These must have been some serious people if they needed to smoke cannabis after opium just to get their rocks off. Number 3. Lost City of Tinea. Yet another lost city has been found by archaeologists in Greece. It seems that there's no end to ancient cities spread across the Mediterranean. This is the lost city of Tinea, and it was likely founded 3,000 years ago by Trojan prisoners after their devastating defeat in the Trojan War. You know, the one where they were defeated by Brad Pitt and an enormous wooden horse? It's likely that the survivors of the Trojan War fled to the south of Greece, where they constructed a small village. The search for this lost city began in 1984, when an archaeologist discovered a sarcophagus near the small village of Chiliomodi, just slightly south of Athens. After the first sarcophagus was found, a huge archaeological undertaking went down, but not until 2013. And it wasn't until 2018 that a graveyard was found that contained the remains of Trojan men and women. These tombs were stocked with bronze and gold jewelry, gold coins, and other valuable grave relics. This indicates that the people who had lived in the ancient city of Tinea must have been pretty wealthy. But it wasn't until after the graveyard was found that the first buildings of the ancient city were discovered. The researchers finally found beams, columns, and stone floors buried under the dirt that suggests the city had once stood, but throughout the centuries had been destroyed and built over. The people who lived in Tinea were likely the last of the Trojan warriors. Their city probably thrived from between 323 and 146 BC, when the Roman Empire occupied Greece and brought the entire region under imperial control. Number 2. Spanish Stonehenge. As time goes on, we seem to find more and more Stonehenge copycats throughout the world. In 2019 alone, a severe drought caused water levels to drop, which revealed an ancient stone circle of over 100 standing rocks. But what's really incredible about this new Spanish Stonehenge is that it's dated to be at least 7,000 years old. According to NBC News, it's known as the Dolmen of Guadalperal, and it vanished in 1963 when the Spanish government constructed a reservoir to feed a hydroelectric dam. The photos of the revealed structure were snapped by NASA's Landsat 8 satellite in the middle of July, and it sparked renewed interest in the mysterious monument. Even though the stone circle was originally excavated in the 1920s by a German archaeologist, his findings were never published until the 1960s. By then, the reservoir was already planned to be flooded. For that reason, modern archaeologists have never been able to properly excavate or investigate the standing rocks, which are believed to have been part of an enclosed structure. They may also have been used as a tomb, a site for trade in ancient times, or even for religious rituals. Unfortunately, the reservoir has since filled back up with water, and it's now impossible to study the Spanish Stonehenge properly. Number 1. Unusual dog burial. Animal burials are nothing new when it comes to ancient Egypt. It's now fairly well known that the ancient Egyptians mummified all kinds of animals, from dogs to baboons. We also now know that there were special cults in ancient Egypt that practiced mass sacrifice of dogs and cats. However, a new discovery made a few years ago of an unusual canine burial in a brick structure in Abydos has raised even more questions about the ancient Egyptian practices of animal burial. It all began when a pair of preserved dogs were found curled inside a large ceramic pot that dated back 3,000 years. It was the very first time that dogs have ever been found inside of burial jars. The pups were nicknamed Houdini and Chewy, as horribly inappropriate as that may be, and they even had their fur still intact. Because of the size of the dogs, researchers at the time could not understand how they were forced into the jars. What researchers could determine was that the dogs were about 5 years old when they died and were likely sacred animals in life. Because of the way they were buried, they must have been held in high regard within the community. However, scientists and Egyptologists don't know who the dogs were, why they were so important, or who they had belonged to, if they had even belonged to anyone. For those who don't know, Abydos, the location where the dogs were found, was constructed around 2750 BC and dedicated to the Second Dynasty king, Khasa Khemui. Which of these strange discoveries did you enjoy the most?
The Chicken Church. The Chicken Church is by far one of the strangest abandoned structures in the world. It was originally built in 1990 after Daniel Alamja dreamed that God told him to construct a church on a hill in which all the religions of the world could worship together in harmony. At first, Daniel did not take too much stock in the dream, but then on a trip into the Indonesian countryside, he witnessed the very same hill from his dream. Daniel purchased the land, he began construction on the Chicken Church, but eventually he ran out of money. Daniel was forced to abandon the church before it was ever completed. It was not for another 15 years until 2015 that interest was renewed in the Chicken Church thanks to news articles that showed up online featuring the weird structure. More and more tourists then began flocking to this place in Indonesia, and the money earned from these tourists allowed Daniel to go back to the Chicken Church and keep building. Unfortunately, the church has yet to be finished. Underneath the structure are at least 15 unfinished rooms, many of which have become sanctuaries for homeless people and drug addicts. The walls are littered with graffiti, the church is crumbling little by little into ruin, and even some bats have taken roost. It looks like even with tourist numbers going up, the church will probably never be finished. And as a side note, Daniel told news reports that the church is not actually based on a chicken, it's supposed to look like a dove. Michigan Central Station. Nothing symbolizes the tragic fall of Detroit quite like Michigan Central Station. This abandoned yet beautiful building shows just how far Detroit has fallen from its days of automotive glory. The Michigan Central Station was occupied and functional for 75 years. It was used to ship the people of Detroit off to war, to bring them home, to send them on vacation, and so much more. But for the last 30 years, Michigan Central Station has been home to nothing but vandals. Oh yeah, and some junkies and some homeless people. The sounds of laughter and joy have been replaced by the whir of cameras going off, the slow dripping of water leaking from the roof, and the hissing of spray paint. The station is abandoned, decrepit, and will likely be destroyed sometime in the future. This is exceptionally sad considering the station's history. It began its conception in 1908 and had its framework in place by December of 1912. Michigan Central Station was formally opened on January 4th, 1914 after a fire at the old transport depot in December of 1913 caused a premature opening. In today's money, the station set back the city of Detroit about $55 million, but nobody could have seen the fall of the industry just 40 years later. By the 1950s, rail depots all over the country were being abandoned because of the decline in business. Pieces of the station began being sold off in 1956. The waiting room was closed in 1967, and then many of the grand walnut benches were sold off at just $25 each. All the amenities vanished, and the entire building was eventually bankrupted and shut down. Abandoned mental asylum in the woods. Probably one of the strangest abandoned places you could find right now is located in the absolute middle of nowhere. I'm talking about an abandoned mental asylum in the woods that almost nobody knows about. First, you need to travel to New York State. Then you'll need to go about 25 miles north of Pomona. From there, you need to find a trail leading off into a spooky wood. You will then find yourself surrounded by trees on an old worn path with nobody else on it. Continue along this path and you will find a cemetery littered with hundreds of grave markers, most of which are not named. The grave markers only have numbers on them. But if you go even further, you will come upon the abandoned Letchworth Village, which was founded in 1911 as a state institution for the segregation of the epileptic and feeble-minded. In other words, it was founded as a home for the mentally insane. It's unclear exactly what happened to the mental asylum, but judging by the ridiculous number of gravestones, there were at least 900 burials from between 1917 and 1967. It's not clear what kind of horrors went on in this place or why it shut down, but I have a feeling that we may be better off not knowing. In fact, we should probably let the abandoned bones of this institute slowly be reclaimed by nature. Grossingers Resort. Grossingers Resort was once a luxurious getaway in the Catskills, frequented by the wealthiest members of society. This was back in the 1950s before airfare was cheap and easy. Rather than flying from New York to Miami, it was easier to take a luxurious summer vacation in the Catskills at one of the many prominent holiday resorts. Grossingers Resort was one of the best. It was situated in the hills of the small town of Liberty, and for decades, at least 150,000 visitors stayed at the resort every year. The facilities were state-of-the-art. It was the first resort ever in the United States to offer skiing throughout the year with artificial snow, and it was even the inspiration for the movie Dirty Dancing. All of this is made even more amazing by the fact that Grossingers Resort started as a small family business in 1917 created by Austrian immigrants. But all good things must come to an end. This fascinating place of luxury eventually fell into disrepair in 1972. Global travel was kicking up, airfare was down, and people could easily fly outside of New York. By 1986, the hotel was forced to close. Since then, it has become a literal ruin. But if you look close enough, you can still see the nostalgic pleasures of the 1950s. Of course, if you look even closer, you can probably spot a ghost or two as well. Specifically, the indoor swimming pools look like a great meeting place for the mortally challenged. Temple of Santiago. The Temple of Santiago is a church in the state of Chiapas, Mexico that was abandoned hundreds of years ago. However, it's been sitting underwater for the past 50 years, drowned and somewhat forgotten. This church has had an extremely rough life. As reported by the Daily Mail, the church was built in the middle of the 16th century in the year 1564 by a group of monks. Locals had at the time expected the population in the area around the church to flourish, but that never happened. Then a plague devastated the area and the temple was subsequently abandoned in the year 1773. For the next few hundred years, the temple remained a ghostly sight in an otherwise barren landscape never really visited by anyone. Then in 1966, the area was flooded to create a reservoir for a nearby dam. It was not until 2002 that a drought caused water levels to drop so significantly that tourists could walk all the way to the church. It has since become wildly popular with foreign and domestic tourists, and even though the water levels have risen once more, there are now fishermen who take curious visitors by boat to see the remains of this strange and oddly captivating temple. Kilchur Castle. Kilchur Castle in Scotland is strangely mystifying. This is one of the most fascinating abandoned relics in the entire country. There is not much left of it anymore, but it was once a fabulous structure. The castle was originally built in 1450 by the first Lord of Glenorchy. It was a 5-story tower house complete with a courtyard and a giant outer wall. The castle went on to be extended through the following centuries. In 1681, the castle was transformed into a barracks capable of housing at least 200 troops. And then between 1750 and 1945, the castle was used as a government garrison, but Kilchur Castle was eventually abandoned in 1760 after it was struck by lightning and seriously damaged. The remains of the tower are still sitting upside down in the middle of the courtyard. What's even more interesting is that the castle was originally built on a small island in the middle of a lake, but then in 1817, the water level fell and connected the castle to the mainland. Today, the castle is in the care of Historic Scotland and is open to visitors, but it has never been restored and is still slowly crumbling into ruin. Kloster Heiligan. Kloster Heiligan is an ancient monastery in Germany that has been destroyed by fire on so many occasions that the general consensus is that God hates it. This building is located deep inside the Black Forest of Germany, and today it stands a strange and haunting ruin. According to historical reports, the first abbey was built on the site in 1192. It was a simple wooden construction, but over the next few centuries, the church grew and grew. Local donations helped the church to be upgraded, and it became quite the impressive structure. However, a fire destroyed the monastery in 1470. The church was restored, but in 1555, another fire destroyed it yet again. Repairs were made after that, and the church stayed alive. Then in 1804, the church was struck by lightning and was lit on fire for a third time. Nobody bothered repairing it this time, and the monastery was abandoned and left to rot. But even today, the ruins of the church still stand. It has been kept from bursting into flames a fourth time by historic preservationists. Monks and pilgrims do flock to the site, and it's become very popular with tourists. If you plan on visiting the Black Forest in Germany, I suggest in the autumn when the temperatures are moderate and the spooky atmosphere is at its spookiest. Aniva Rock Lighthouse. The Aniva Rock Lighthouse was built in 1939 by the Japanese. All these years later, it still stands on a piece of rock located slightly east of mainland Russia, right between the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk. The Russians had originally wanted the building for use as a penal colony, but instead the two nations managed to come to an agreement and split the island. As a result, a ring of lighthouses was built along the rocky coast to signal incoming ships and troop carriers. But after 50 years of sharing the island, the Russians pretty much stole it. This action caused 500,000 Japanese people to be evacuated back to the northern island of Hokkaido, and in 1951 the island was officially given to the Russians. But the Aniva Rock Lighthouse still remains all these years and conflicts later. It might be abandoned, but it's still there. It's also in one of the most rural and relatively unimportant places on Earth. The lighthouse is full of old equipment and diesel engines, and the only ones who visit it anymore are the seagulls. The Great Wall of China. A lot of people don't know that after 2,300 years of construction, the Great Wall of China was pretty much abandoned. Yes, it is still the longest wall on Earth, and yes, it was first constructed to prevent the Mongolians from invading the country, and also to protect the Silk Road trade in the 700s. This doesn't seem completely fair considering it was the Mongolians who started the Silk Road in the first place, but it is what it is. And in any case, the Great Wall really cemented the northernmost border of China. But the original structure is not actually what you see today. After all those years of building, the wall was pretty much abandoned. It was way too expensive to maintain and to guard, and so the dynasties that came after its construction either let it rot or actually ripped some sections of it apart to use for building supplies. In fact, the sections of the Great Wall that you see today were mostly constructed by the Ming Dynasty during the 1400s. This is because the Ming Dynasty construction workers used bricks and stone rather than just earth, and so their sections have survived much better. Most of the other sections decayed into nothingness after the abandonment or became completely unusable. In the Gobi Desert, miles and miles of the wall are completely buried in sand, and in other places the wall is completely taken over by forest. Only some spots are open to visitors, with the most popular section being near the city of Beijing. The most haunted house in Italy. Nothing is quite as strange as an abandoned haunted house, and there is no haunted house more haunted than the Villa dei Vici, also referred to as the Red House, located near Lake Como in Italy. The house was originally constructed as a mansion in the 19th century. However, the house has been abandoned for decades and falling into complete degradation. So far as the local legend goes, there are still ghosts living in the villa, and they play the piano on a nightly basis. The villa is completely surrounded by woods and totally isolated. It's not actually known when the manor was first abandoned, but many people believe it happened after the original owner of the house found his wife and daughter horribly murdered. The original owner of the house died soon after the event, which may or may not have happened, and then the house fell into disrepair. It remained abandoned until the 1920s when Aleister Crowley spent a few nights in the villa inspired by the supposed ghosts. It's been said that Mr. Crowley performed satanic rites and possibly even murdered someone within the Red House's walls. To this day, local Italians are nervous to go near the house, and to be quite frank, it's just a matter of time until someone comes along and demolishes the Villa dei Vici and erases its dark past. The Magnetic Boy. You may have heard of the Magnetic Boy before. He's a 6-year-old kid from Croatia who attracted a lot of media attention a few years ago for apparently being a miniature Magneto. Metal objects like forks and spoons stuck to his body. Ivan is his name, and his family claimed that he was magnetic. However, this story has kind of a hilarious twist. Ivan the Magnetic Boy never actually developed special abilities. It turned out in the end that Ivan was actually just sticky. According to a recent report from Live Science, some professionals got together and debunked the Magnetic Boy. They said that first of all, one of the photos shows Ivan with a plastic remote control stuck to his chest. Considering remote controls are plastic and not metal, that right there says a lot. The experts are saying that because young Ivan has smooth skin without any hair, he probably just has really sticky skin. And this is obviously not a superpower or a special ability. Some people just have sticky skin. All people have a little bit of stickiness going on with their skin, but some people are extra sticky. At the end of the day, the Magnetic Boy isn't as special as everyone thought, he just has really slimy skin. The Man Who Ate an Airplane. This next one is a little strange. Is it a superpower to eat an entire airplane? Some might say yes, some might say no. But a man named Michael Latito believed himself extraordinary for the simple triumph of eating an entire airplane, among other things. He didn't eat the aircraft all at once, of course, it took him 2 years to finish it, but he did eat an entire Cessna 150 airplane piece by piece. He also ate 18 bicycles, 7 TVs, 2 beds, 15 supermarket shopping carts, a computer, a coffin, 6 chandeliers, and even a pair of skis. So is he superhuman or just super insane? According to Ripley's Believe It or Not, it's all about the digestive system. Doctors determined long ago that Mr. Latito had an extremely resilient digestive system with an extra thick stomach lining and intestines. The result was that he was able to eat pretty much anything. While definitely not the most useful superpower, it is still pretty amazing. Unfortunately, the man who ate a plane passed away of natural causes back in 2007 at the ripe old age of 57. Sudden Artist. To be quite honest, most spectacular abilities involve a malfunction with the brain and a sudden ability to create. Whether it be art or music, a stroke or a coma, 99% of the people on Earth who develop superpowers do so after a brain injury, and their superpower is usually something artistic. Take John Sarkin, for example. He had been working as a chiropractor when he suffered a horrible stroke. This happened at only 35 years old, but after his stroke, John turned into a visual artist with an insatiable need to create. After his stroke, he couldn't stop making beautiful and incredible art. But how could a stroke turn John into an artist? Apparently, the left side of John's brain was extremely deprived of oxygen during his stroke. Because of this, John was forced to rely more on the other side of his brain. It meant that he had to interact with his world differently. Because he now saw the world in a different light and interpreted the people and things around him differently, he essentially turned into an artist, and that's really what's going on with these types of post-accident creatives. Electric piano. Could you imagine getting struck by lightning? Meet Tony Sosoria, who had been minding his own business at a phone booth back in 1994 when a lightning bolt came out of nowhere and struck him in the head. This is an incredibly rare thing to happen, and miraculously, he survived the incident without any more than a few burns on his face and foot. But what's really incredible is that ever since Tony was hit by the lightning, he's had melodies stuck in his head. He became obsessed with the desire to listen to piano music. The problem for Tony was that he couldn't play any instruments. Tony was a doctor at the time he was struck by lightning, specializing in orthopedic medicine. He was barely 42 years old and knew nothing about music, but that didn't stop Tony from chasing his new impulses. Within a few months of being struck by lightning, Tony was spending almost all of his time playing and composing music on the piano. Then in 2007, Tony debuted his first piano composition in Connecticut. That was 13 years after he was struck by lightning. The electricity from the sky literally turned Tony into a magic man on the piano. While it might not be as great a superpower as flying or teleporting, it's definitely pretty cool. You can even watch Tony playing his lightning sonata on the piano. It's the same melody he's heard in his head ever since the bolt of lightning crashed down on him. If you could have any superhuman ability, what would you wish for? Music? Super hearing? Telling the future? Anything? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Human Jukebox. Let's keep it moving with another musical power. A man named Derek is known as the Human Jukebox. This is because unlike most pianists who need to read music to play it, Derek only needs to hear the song once to replay the entire thing perfectly. Derek is also known as a savant. This means that he's mentally impaired, and yet he is gifted with other special abilities that exceed the average person's talents. It's like if you could just pick up a guitar and play any song you heard on the radio just by hearing it once, but you'd have to sacrifice something else in order to do it. So where did Derek get this amazing power? Well, it all began 15 weeks before he was supposed to be born. He was very premature and came out into the world blind and autistic. He couldn't read or communicate properly, but somehow he was able to use music as a form of communication. He actually started playing the piano at only 2 years old on a toy organ. By the age of 4, he was playing the piano on his elbows and on the backs of his hands, and he was playing some pretty complex pieces. When he got older, Derek attended the Linden Lodge School of the Blind in London. Now he spends most of his time playing the piano, composing and improvising music, and hanging out with family and friends. And no, scientists have no idea how he's able to memorize and then mimic any piece of piano music. Most professionals believe that since Derek is a savant, his brain became hypersensitive to compensate for the damaged parts, and this heightened his auditory abilities. The First Cyborg. A man named Neil Harbison is the world's first legal cyborg. That's right, this guy is literally part human and part robot. He has an antenna implanted in his skull that gives him a very special ability. Maybe not special to you or I, but special to him. You see, Neil was diagnosed as being completely colorblind. The antenna installed inside of his brain gives him the ability to see color, and the most amazing part about it is that Neil developed this technology himself. Neil worked with another computer scientist to develop something that they called the iBorg. It's an antenna attached to a very small computer and a pair of headphones. Then at the end of the antenna is a webcam that translates color into 360 different waves of sound that Neil listens to through his headphones, allowing him to understand which colors he's looking at. Although this might sound like something from a weird science fiction movie in the future, it's happening right now. Neil literally has an extra sense that nobody else has. According to a report from CNN, it took Neil a full 5 weeks to get over the headaches that he was getting from listening to so many new colors. It then took him another 5 months to be able to decipher which frequencies belong to which colors. It's a pretty impressive technology, and it apparently turned going to a supermarket into visiting a nightclub because of all the sound frequencies being transmitted into his brain. What's really interesting is that after installing the cyborg apparatus into his brain, Neil said that his concept of race changed. According to the sounds that he hears, black people aren't actually black, but they appear as very dark orange to him. And people who are white appear as extremely light orange. It's totally bizarre and absolutely fascinating. The Deaf Composer. Almost everybody knows who Beethoven is, but what a lot of people don't know is that Ludwig van Beethoven, the legendary composer that created some of the most beautiful music in the universe, was deaf. Not only that, but he went deaf halfway through his career. While some people see Beethoven's triumph over his lack of hearing as an example of determination, others say that going deaf actually heightened his ability to compose music. Of course, Beethoven didn't go deaf overnight. It was a gradual process that went on and on throughout his career, but as he grew older, his music began to sound a little different. That's because he could not rely on his ears anymore. Beethoven actually composed much of his music later in life solely on vibration, and this enabled him to create a completely unique sound that has yet to be replicated. It just goes to show that our senses are more powerful than most of us give them credit for. Indestructible Bones. There is a family out there with bones so strong they simply won't break. The DNA of an extended family in Connecticut has been sampled and analyzed by genetic specialists from the Yale Bone Center in an attempt to understand how genetic mutation can cause high bone density. This is something of an anomaly in human genetics. Members of this single family have bones so strong that they have been compared to the hero played by Bruce Willis in the movie Unbreakable. They have extraordinarily dense bones, making them the most indestructible people on the planet. Unfortunately, we don't know much about these people. 20 members of the family gave blood samples to be DNA tested, and all of them had their bone density measured. 9 members of the family had normal bone density, but the other 11 were superhuman. What makes this really incredible is obviously if scientists can figure out how to locate and isolate the gene mutation, we could be looking at people in the future with unbreakable bones. And if you ask me, that is a legit superpower. Nobody would need to be scared of skateboards or rollerblades anymore. Of course, it's unlikely unlikely that the family members developed their strong bones somewhere in life. It's more likely that one of their ancestors was born with a genetic mutation hundreds or even thousands of years ago, and it's slowly been carried forward through descendants. Supermemory. How would you like to be one of only 80 people to remember every detail of every second of your life? It might be more trouble than it's worth. A woman named Rebecca has been diagnosed with something known as highly superior autobiographical memory, and it is a very real superpower. This condition prevents people from being able to forget, and like I already said, less than 100 people in the world have it. This power doesn't relate only to events either. Rebecca can remember dreams she had when she was only 18 months old, and she can even remember being photographed only 12 days after her birth. Even more bizarre, Rebecca can recite the entire collection of Harry Potter books. Scientists are unsure what causes this incredibly rare condition. However, some professionals do believe that human beings never truly forget anything, we just have trouble bringing it to the surface. But that does not explain why Rebecca and the others like her are able to develop such unbelievable memories. We may never unlock the secret to this power. The Iceman. Wim Hof, also known as the Iceman, is the closest thing on Earth to a person with superhuman abilities, and no, he was not born special. He gained his powers through raw determination. That's right, Wim Hof conquered the world using nothing but his own commitment and a special breathing practice. It's no joke either, he has set some serious world records. According to Guinness World Records, Hof has swum the furthest under ice, going a full 188.6 feet, but that's nothing. He has a world record for the fastest half marathon ran barefoot on ice and snow. He has the longest record for being in full contact with ice, over 1 hour and 42 minutes. He also climbed to 23,600 feet on Mount Everest wearing nothing but shorts and shoes. That really puts the hardcore climbers and all their fancy gear to shame. So what allows this guy to run up the side of Mount Everest in shorts and sneakers while other people are wrapped up like Eskimos? Was he born with some kind of special skin that nobody else has? No. He's just a normal guy who has gained the ability to focus his mind and his breathing to essentially make him impervious to fatigue or cold. And what makes Wim Hof's story extra special is that anyone can become super enough to climb a mountain in their shorts if they just put their mind to it. Focus, determination, and patience are the key to becoming superhuman. Which of these superpowers would you prefer to have? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching. Stop by again for another great video, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.